You're listening to Music for a While, Westben's podcast devoted to exploring the wonderful world of music. Let's take a look behind the scenes to learn about the creators and the performers who continue to bring this art form to life. This episode is sponsored by Finley and Associates, as well as Caravaggio Orthotic Clinic. To learn all about our generous sponsors, please take a look in the description below and visit our website, www.westben.ca. While you're listening, we invite you to engage with the podcast by subscribing or following wherever you may be listening from. Leaving a quick review on iTunes is also very helpful and helps the podcast family grow. Now please enjoy this episode all about two great female composers, Clara Schumann and Fannie Mendelson.
Welcome to Music for a While. I'm Brian Finley. Today, Barb Hobart and I discuss two of the most fascinating musical artists of the 19th century, Fannie Mendelson and Clara Schumann. Fannie Mendelson lived from 1805 to 1847. She was a prolific composer and an accomplished pianist who grew up in Berlin and received a thorough musical education which began at the age of 4 with her mother. Her brother Felix Mendelson was born 4 years after Fannie. And although they were extremely close for their entire but short lives, Felix's life as a professional musician took quite a different turn than Fannie's. Such were the times. Nevertheless, Fannie composed over 460 pieces of music, including a piano trio, a piano quartet, an orchestra, overture, 4 cantatas, over 125 pieces for the piano, and over 250 songs. Most of her music went unpublished in her lifetime. Some was published, but under her brother's name, and a handful was finally published under her own name. A perpetual champion of her brother's music, Fannie's death from a stroke at the age of 42 was followed 6 months later by the death of Felix, also of a stroke. Clara Schumann lived from 1819 to 1896. Regarded as one of the most distinguished pianists of the Romantic era, some listeners preferred her playing even to the mesmerizing Franz Liszt. She enjoyed a 61-year concert career, greatly influencing the format and repertoire of the piano recital, away from displays of empty virtuosity to programs of more serious character. And she was one of the first to play from memory. As a composer, she wrote solo piano pieces, a piano concerto, chamber music, choral pieces, and of course, songs, one of which we'll hear later in this podcast. Clara grew up in Leipzig as a child prodigy, intensively trained by her father, Friedrich Wieck. She began touring at the age of 11 and was successful in places like Paris and Vienna. And then, against the will of her domineering father, she married Robert Schumann. Together with Robert, she helped shape the course of music making and composition for the rest of the century through her performances, teaching, editing, and composition. After losing Robert to mental illness in 1856, Clara lived another 40 years, dying in 1896 at the age of 76. As a footnote, she appeared a little more recently on the 100 Deutsche Mark banknote in circulation from 1989 to 2002. How about that? Well, let's find Barb and get the conversation going. And to warm up, let me give you a little taste of the music of Clara Schumann. Here's the opening of the Romance in A minor, Opus 21, number 1. That was the opening of the Romance in A minor, Opus 21, number 1, by Clara Schumann. Barb, good morning.
Good morning, Brian.
Now, I got to start by asking you a question. Are you happy that you were born in these times?
Oh, absolutely. Both of the ladies that we are going to be talking, or the women we are going to be talking about today, were excellent composers, but because of the time in which they lived, there were huge obstacles. They were allowed to perform, but to get their work published was just almost impossible.
Different times for them, for sure. I know Fannie's father said, music will perhaps become Felix's profession, but for you, it can and must be only an ornament.
Well, and worse than that, on her birthday, he sent her a card and said, "You can still improve. You must take yourself in hand and concentrate harder. You must school yourself more seriously and eagerly for your true profession, a young woman, your only profession being mistress of your house."
Well, that's amazing. And this is a woman who performed for her father all 24 preludes from Bach's 24, from the 24 preludes and fugues of Book 1, from the Well-Tempered Clavier, from memory for her father at the age of 18 or so.
Yes.
So this is no slouch we're talking about.
No, it wasn't. It's really interesting. Her mother was her first teacher, but her mother in turn had been taught by a student of Bach. And I mean, she was born into quite the family. Her grandfather Moses was famous as a philosopher. He was a critic. He was a Bible translator. He was a commentator. Her father was a banker. Her mother came from a very wealthy family of factory owners, but her parents were interested in and patrons of the arts, but especially music. And in 1852, when the family moved to Berlin, they had regular concerts on Sunday morning in their home. And like her brother, she was a formidable pianist. But at a very young age, she also composed cadenzas for Beethoven's piano concertos, as well as, I think she was like 9 or 10, she performed his piano sonata, the Hammer Clavier.
My goodness, that's no slouch, as I say.
No slouch. And she wrote a prodigious amount of music, even some 450 compositions, most of which disappeared from the public domain after her death for well over a century.
Well, that's an amazing thing, because we always think of her brother Felix Mendelson, who was a little bit younger than she was. Mm-hmm. He was 4 years, I think it was, 3 or 4 years younger than Fannie, and must have been greatly influenced by his big sister, who was this amazing musician.
And her works included songs, piano pieces, but she also did larger works, including a 15-movement cantata to commemorate the end of the cholera epidemic in Berlin. And there was a piano cycle that featured the months of the year. And her very last major composition was a piano trio in D minor, which, by the way, you can hear on YouTube. And it was written for her sister. But as I say, most of her works were performed in the music room of the family residence. But don't think these were like intimate little concerts, because this room apparently could hold close to 100 people.
Oh, my.
And she presented a bi-weekly concert series where she would sometimes even direct a chorus. She played the works of Bach, Handel, Beethoven, her brother, and of course her own. And her music was heard by Queen Victoria, though in a roundabout way, because 6 of her earliest songs were published under Felix's name. And when he played for Victoria in 1842, he accompanied the monarch, and she sang this song called Italian. But like the loving brother he was, Felix informed the Queen that while the name on the manuscript might be his, it was actually his sister who had written it.
Oh, my goodness. And what did the Queen think of that?
She apparently chose to sing something else.
Well, you know, you mentioned a piece that Fannie had composed called The Year. And I found a wonderful quote about that, about her feeling about this. Now, it's a very interesting thing, and this shows her to be more than just a musical composer, but actually an artist as well, too. The music was, for example, the music was written on tinted sheets of paper, and it was illustrated by her husband, Wilhelm. And each piece was accompanied by a short poem, which is very interesting. And this is what Fannie said about this. She says, "I've been composing a good deal lately, and have called piano pieces after the names of my favorite haunts, partly because they really came to my mind at these spots, partly because of our pleasant excursions were in my mind while I was writing them. They were from a delightful souvenir, a kind of secondary diary. But do not imagine that I give these names when playing them in society. They are for home use entirely." So this brings up a really interesting topic about what Fannie thought of herself and her role in composing music and sharing it with the world. And it's something that I think a lot of people haven't thought as much as they might have about the difference between amateur musicians and professional musicians.
Well, and she could be, somebody wrote about her that besides being this wonderful pianist and this composer, she had a really fierce intellect, and she despised what she called amateurism on the concert stage.
Well, she must have been an extremely well crafted musician.
Oh, my goodness. Goethe said of her, I love this, though, because it is kind of, I think, a bit of a backhanded compliment in a way. Goethe said to her that she had the strength of 6 men piano players. Oh. But you know what? When you talked about her husband, there's some parallels here with Clara Schumann, because Fannie fell in love with the painter William Hensel. And he was the son of an impoverished Protestant clergyman who was struggling to become known in artistic circles. And this was not a person that Leah Mendelson considered husband material. So she stipulated that Hensel had to go away for 5 years, and he was not allowed to write to Fannie. Leah would write and give him the family news. And if after 5 years they felt the same way, the marriage would be sanctioned. So it's the tugs of society on these not only relationships, but on why you're here on Earth and what you're allowed to do. What society will allow you to do, and how you have to react to that. Program yourself to live up to that, or ignore it, or whatever you decide. Well, and it was really interesting because they had to keep the engagement secret from an aunt, because the aunt was an Orthodox Jew. And of course, they had taken on the Bartholdi because of the anti-Semitism. But in her diary, I love this, she wrote, "The ceremony took place at 4:00. The sermon was of no interest. The church was full." But she also wrote the processional for, how it came about was she was going to come down the aisle to a piece of box. But apparently, the day before, she couldn't find the manuscript. So she sat down and wrote her own processional. Felix was supposed to write the recessional, but he had fallen out of a carriage and injured his foot and couldn't even make it for the wedding. So the night of the wedding supper, with all these guests around, she sat down and wrote the processional for the organ. So in the space of a day, she wrote 2 organ pieces.
My God. Well, it's a good thing around a wedding there's really not much else to do. So that's quite amazing. But she apparently was very feisty, and her relationship with her brother is something we need to talk about. And became a huge caretaker of his music. There's one story here in 1838 when in Berlin there were rehearsals for Felix's St. Paul oratorio, and she was listening to the rehearsal, and she wrote afterwards, "Suffering and champing at the bit as I heard the whining and the accompanist's dirty fingers on the piano. They started one passage at half the right tempo, and I instinctively called out, 'My God, it must go twice as fast.'"
Well, interestingly enough, she and Hensel only had one child, and she named him Sebastian Ludwig Felix, after her favorite composers, perhaps not in order of preference, but I think chronologically.
Right.
But it's interesting. She published her first work under her own name at age 41, and died the next year following a stroke.
Oh, my goodness.
And so in 2010, music experts discovered a work traditionally ascribed to Felix was actually by Fannie, and it had its first performance under her name on International Women's Day 2017. But it's just, as I say, it's just, she struggled her entire life with the conflicting impulses of authorship versus the social expectation of her high-class status.
And I sense that this was an internal struggle as much as an external struggle.
Absolutely. Felix's friend Henry Chorley had said of her, had she been a poor man's daughter, she might have become known to the world by the side of Madame Schumann and Madame Pleyel as a female pianist of the highest order. And despite Felix's support of her music, he did write, "From my knowledge of Fannie, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for authorship." I don't know where he got that.
Well, let's go back a second to her first publication, which came out late in her life, as you say.
Yes.
And she writes after that publication, Felix wrote to her after that publication, "I send you my professional blessing on becoming a member of the craft. You may have much happiness in giving pleasure to others. May you taste only the sweets and none of the bitterness of authorship. May the public pelt you with roses and never with sand." And Fannie wrote back in her journal, "Felix has written and given me his professional blessing in the kindest manner. I know that he's not quite satisfied in his heart of hearts, but I am glad that he has said a kind word to me about it."
And he wasn't, because he also wrote to her, "From my knowledge of Fannie, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for authorship. She is too much all that a woman ought to be for this. She regulates her house and neither thinks of the public, nor of the musical world, nor even of music at all until her first duties are fulfilled. Publishing would only disturb her in this, and I cannot say that I approve of it."
You know, it sounds shocking to our ears in this century.
Oh.
And I just wonder if there was a hugely different sense of duty and expectation in that time, that people had roles, especially those who were in higher society functions, that society dictated a role that they needed to fulfill, and sort of everybody understood that, I suppose. I don't know, but to us it just sounds ludicrous.
It does. And you know, the interesting thing, you can't have a discussion of Fannie without delving into the relationship with her brother.
Yeah.
Because when they were apart, they wrote each other every day. And Michael Steen, who's a musicologist that I really like, wrote, "It is doubtful if Felix loved any woman, including his wife, as much as he did Fannie. And on her wedding day, Fannie wrote to Felix, 'I have your portrait before me, and ever repeating your dear name and thinking of you as if you stood by my side. Every morning and every moment of my life, I shall love you from the bottom of my heart, and I am sure in so doing, I shall not wrong Hensel.'"
My goodness, this is on her wedding day.
This was on her wedding day.
When poor Felix was there with a sore foot, having fallen out of the carriage.
Well,
he probably needed a little bit of a love note at that point.
But you know, I didn't realize that she wrote choral works.
Yes.
But her choral works were resurrected by one Amelia LeClaire of Boston, who was a resident scholar of musical studies in the States. And she remembers clearly why she focused on Fannie. She said, "I was a composer who was told there weren't any women composers. So some 10 years ago, I decided to go looking. And this woman started a group called, I don't know how you pronounce this, I know the Capella, but I think it's called Clausura, to bring into the world music of unsung female composers dating from the 9th century. And she found a lot of music was in the Mendelson archive. It wasn't hiding, it just nobody had looked for it." And she makes a really interesting point that women like Fannie, I think you'll find this fascinating. Women like Fannie operated under the radar because they didn't have an employer telling them the rules. They didn't have someone saying, "You must write this, you must write that." So in one piece, LeClaire says, and you would understand this because I don't, says Fannie has a line in this chorus where the singers are singing a diminished fifth chord, otherwise known as the devil's tritone.
Yes, that is. That's the diminished fifth, augmented fourth. It's the horse, mule, bum, 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 tradition. It's that thing that harmony that's been used for angst for forever.
Okay, so then the other thing I found interesting is that her great-great-great-granddaughter tells the story and says that in her lifetime, despite a crooked back and wearing spectacles, she was adored for her musicality and warmth, but feared for her fierce intellect.
Wow, isn't that great? Well,
Yes.
by all accounts, she was a very pleasant person.
Yeah. Well, in 1829, she wrote in her journal, "I played my Easter sonata. This sonata is fascinating. It was completely forgotten until a freak of fate brought it forward 140 years later.
My goodness.
The manuscript was found by a man who bought a book in a Paris bookshop in 1970, and somehow or other this manuscript was in the book. And the man who found it thought he had an unknown piece by Felix because the headline said F. Mendelson. But some careful sleuthing by a young American musicologist, Angela Christian, showed that it was actually Fannie's piece.
And she had referenced it in her diaries, or there was a way that they could trace it back to her as well.
Yeah.
In the diaries.
Yeah.
Well, it's amazing. Back to that publishing moment for her, because I think that it's interesting to see further her reaction to that. We know Felix's reaction, but hers. She wrote about that publication. "I can truthfully say that I let it happen more than made it happen. And it is this in particular which cheers me. If the publishers want more from me, it should act as a stimulus to achieve. If the matter comes to an end, then I also won't grieve, for I'm not ambitious." And that final sentence is a haunting sentence for me. Why would she not be ambitious? And is that really truthful with this vast amount of output that she had?
I was going to say, when you consider she wrote over 400 pieces, to think that you would say, "I'm not ambitious," that in itself is hugely ambitious.
Yeah, that's
in one
true.
sense of the word.
Yeah, true. And she, as a pianist, of course, too, can you accomplish that much without being ambitious? I just don't know. Can you tell us? Do you know anything about her premiere? Like did she actually play in public? She did these salons and so on. But what about the public?
Her first public performance, I don't know exactly how old she was, but I do know the work, Mr. Brian Finley, that she played, because it's a work that I want Mr. Brian Finley to play. She played her brother's Piano Concerto No. 1,
right,
which is just a beautiful piece of music. And I think the first part, the first movement is quite technical. But apparently, some people thought that she was actually a better pianist than Felix.
Wow, that's amazing. Well,
yeah.
And that's going to be similar to our next topic, our next posthumous guest.
Yes,
Clara Schumann. But before we say goodbye to Fannie, can you describe her ending, or how things ended up with she and Felix?
Yes, it was very sad. When she was 41 years old, she had a stroke. And bearing in mind how close the two of them were, Felix was ill and he couldn't even make it to her funeral.
Boy, he missed the wedding and the funeral.
He missed the wedding and the funeral, and he was devastated.
Yeah.
This was a man whose whole life was charmed. He wrote poetry, he drew pictures, he traveled the world. He lived a very an enviable lifestyle, and he had never experienced really anything devastating until Fannie's death.
Well, that and the anti-Semitism, I think,
yes,
was a huge challenge for that whole family as well.
But he experienced several small strokes after Fannie's death, and I think in less than 6 months following Fannie's death, he had a stroke and died.
Oh my goodness, isn't that sad?
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness Fannie is coming back into recognition and appreciation, and let's get in there and get on YouTube and listen to the work of this fantastic composer and fascinating musician. Well, now on to the other guest artist of the day, Clara Schumann, a great pianist, teacher, editor, and composer, and that leaves a lot out. But let's start by listening to some of her beautiful music. Here's soprano Donna Bennett, who joins me for Der Mond kommt still gegangen, The Moon Comes Quietly. The moon comes quietly with its golden glow. In its lovely shimmer, the tired earth sleeps. And floating on the air from many a true heart, waft thousands of loving thoughts over the sleepers. And below in the valley flickers the lit window of my beloved. But I look out into the still darkness of the world.
Der Mond kommt still gegangen mit seinem goldenen Schein. Da schläft in holden Prangen die müde Erde ein. Und auf den Lüften schwanken aus manchem treuen See viel tausend Liebesgedanken über die Schläfe hin. Und drunten im Talle, da funkeln die Fenster von Liebchens Haus. Ich aber blicke im Dunkeln still in die Welt hinaus.
That was Donna Bennett and yours truly performing Der Mond kommt still gegangen, The Moon Comes Quietly. A beautiful song by Clara Schumann. Barb, who is Clara Schumann?
Well, I'll tell you, this was a woman who was just amazing. I mean, she was a publisher, she was a composer, she was a virtuoso pianist, she was a wife, she was a mother to 8 children.
Oh yeah, let's not forget the 8 children.
And her concert career spanned 61 years.
This is truly one of the great performers of all time, arguably, in Western music.
Absolutely. She was born on the 13th of September, 1819, to Frederick Wieck and his wife Marianne, but this was not a happy marriage. And even considering this, I mean, consider the time frame of this. When she was 5, her parents divorced. She didn't live with the mother. She remained with her father, who it is said planned her career, indeed her whole life, while she was still a child. She had daily lessons using some kind of method that he had perfected for teaching piano. And this included theory, composition, counterpoint. She was required to practice for an additional 2 to 3 hours a day.
And this is at the age of 5 or so?
5.
Right.
She was also taught to speak foreign languages. But I found this fascinating. Her father encouraged her to take long walks because he said you needed to be physically fit to play the piano.
Interesting. And you know, the other habit that she developed apparently was letter writing.
Yes.
She would write for hours every day, walk for hours and write for hours. And you know, as a musician, I'm thinking, how the heck does she find time to do all that? And let's
Maybe
not
that's
forget
why
the
she
8
was-
children.
I was going to say, maybe that's why she was able to keep up later on, right? But she made her official debut in Leipzig at age 9. But it was another concert that same year that had very far-reaching consequences. She was engaged to play a house concert for a man who was a director of a hospital. And it was there that she met another young performer named Robert Schumann. And so impressed was he with Clara's playing that he sought to take lessons from her father and rented a room and lived with the family for about a year. And during that same year, her father had Clara's 4 polonaises published. She was 9 years old.
That's amazing. Well, let's dip into Robert for a second, because he was not 9 years old.
No.
I think he was around 18 years old. So this
Yes.
is, anyway, that's just a little interesting color to throw into the
Yes.
story at this point.
That's okay, but following that debut, this 9-year-old, much like a young Mozart, embarked on a concert tour of Paris and other major European cities.
Well, it does sound very familiar to the Mozart story with the father and the son.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in Weimar, the poet Goethe was in attendance, and he wrote, "This girl is amazing." But he was not her only admirer. Her playing was praised by Mendelson, Chopin, and Paganini. And the latter, at one point, agreed to do a concert with her when both were in Paris. But it was, as one musicologist has said, the greatest pairing of virtuosos that few heard, because thousands had fled the city due to a cholera outbreak.
Wow, jeez. So what happens then, it happens now.
Exactly. When she was 16, she premiered her A minor piano concerto, again, a work that you can hear on YouTube. And this has like these wild leaps and these runs that are fantastic. And I read a thing where a modern German woman pianist says performing this work is physically exhausting and left her completely drained.
You know, I have found Clara's works too to be really big in the hand. She must have had very big hands, because she writes for big hands.
Well, things in her life changed big time when she turned 16. Because she was no longer just a talented young girl, but she was a very sophisticated and actually a very handsome young woman. Something that Robert Schumann didn't fail to notice. But as you know, Clara's father really disapproved of any relationship developing. And I think partly because he was aware of Robert's rather, how shall I put this delicately, checkered sexual history.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Well, there's that, but you know, also I'm thinking of the other society thing that Fannie was going through, where a marriage would sort of really point someone in a different direction. And this young woman that he had cultured from 5 years old to be this performing artist, that would drastically change that
Well,
picture.
and you know what, Brian? She did have reservations, because 3 years before they actually got married, the whole court case thing where the father wouldn't let them marry and they went to a judge and the judge said, yes, you can. But 3 years before that, she wrote Robert Schumann a letter. And she said, "I wish to lead a life free from care. And I see that I shall be unhappy if I cannot always work at my art. Ask yourself if you are in a position to offer me that life."
Wow. And
Because
she
when she-
essentially ended up offering him that life, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because when Clara lived with her father, her whole life was music. But Robert, he required apparently peace and quiet with no interruptions to compose. And he would lock himself in the only room they had with the piano for hours on end.
And here's a virtuoso pianist trying to prepare for her life and her career.
Yes, leaving no time. And of course, initially, Robert hoped Clara would stop her concert tours and concentrate on being a wife and a mother. But financial constraints put paid to that idea.
Well, and I doubt that Schumann had as lucrative a career as she had.
No, he didn't.
No,
He didn't.
the performance,
You know
I think,
what?
was one of the foundations of their livelihood.
In their 14 years together, this blew me away. Clara gave close to 139 performances
Unbelievable. Oh, and 8 children.
and 8 children. Yes.
And 2-hour walks and 2-hour letter writing sessions.
As Victor Borge used to say, 8 children, by the way. Not by the way, but 8 children. In terms of composition, she wrote some 66 works. And while she and Robert worked on some songs together, her pieces were in fact, in their lifetime, more popular than his. And there's a wonderful story about a gathering that took place after one of her concerts. And a patron was introduced to Robert, and he said, "Oh, and are you a musician too?" However, to her credit, I have to say, she frequently played his works. She made them known to an international audience, and after he died, she made sure that his legacy lived on.
Oh, I think she really promoted that.
Absolutely. But the sad thing is, I wondered if it was because of his death that she stopped composing at age 36. But it seems that somewhere along the way, she absorbed the pervading idea that composing was not for women. Because she wrote, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it. Should I expect to be the one?"
Wow.
Isn't that sad?
Yeah, that is very sad. Yeah.
And, you know, she might have been remembering actually what Robert wrote once, too, because he wrote, "Clara has written a series of small pieces, more delicate and richly musical in their invention than she's ever achieved before."
I think he was quite complimentary.
Yeah, but then he said, "But having children and a husband who constantly improvises does not fit together with composing. Clara knows her primary occupation is to be a mother." Yeah, and you know what is also really sad? If you look at pictures of her, portraits of her, I've seen 3. One when she was about 16, one when she was like in her late 20s, and then one just before she died. You can see the toll that life took on her. I mean, it's so obvious in her demeanor and in her face. I mean, life was a struggle for her.
Yeah.
But we come to some part of her life that I find very interesting, because both Robert and Clara, as you know, were champions of another young musician, Johannes Brahms. And I didn't know about their relationship until years ago, Brian. At Westben, you did this wonderful thing with your sister, Brenda Finley, where you played Brahms, but she read from letters. And I had up until that time, no idea of the close relationship.
It's a fascinating relationship. The show was called The Loves of Clara, and Donna was in the show as well, too. And we dealt with this topic of the love of Robert Schumann and this new love of Johannes Brahms, junior to Clara, but coming at this time when this terrible affliction was overtaking Robert and destroying that life, and how this young man, fresh as the day, came in with his blonde hair and fresh and beautiful music, and kept with a hat in hand looking for acceptance from the mighty Schumanns, you know, for his fledgling musical career. And it was just one of those instances in history when all the right things line up at the right time. But what a conflict for Clara.
Well, it was, because when Robert was confined to the asylum, doctors didn't want her to go to visit because they thought Schumann would get too upset. So Brahms was the go-between. And sometimes when Clara needed to go on a concert tour, I read that Brahms stayed with the children. And she once wrote to them in a letter, I found this really interesting. "You hardly knew your dear father. You were still too young to feel deep grief. And thus, in those terrible years, you could give me no comfort. Hope, indeed, you could bring me, but it was not enough to support me through such agony. Then came Johannes Brahms. He came like a true friend to share all my sorrows. He strengthened the heart that threatened to break. He uplifted my mind. He cheered my spirit whenever and wherever he could. In short, he was my friend in the fullest sense of the word." But his feelings for Clara are clearly set out in their correspondence, because when her son Felix became ill, he wrote, "God grant that you may be spared any further cares, for you have surely had enough for one life. Let this deep, deep love of mine be a comfort to you, for I love you more than myself and more than anybody or anything on earth."
My goodness, that's quite a confession.
And you know what's really interesting? They had at some point made an agreement that they would burn their letters, but neither one of them seemed to follow to the letter, I might say. And there's been a lot of ink spilled about the exact nature of their relationship.
Well, what do you think, Barb, after all of this?
Well, according to Clara, her feelings were maternal, but Michael Steen again says that...
we're talking about quite a different age bracket as well,
absolutely.
Too. And I, when 15 years or so?
I think so,
something.
Yes.
And I'm...
Although, be careful.
I'm instantly reminded of her relationship with Robert.
Yes.
Being in the other direction, being so much the junior of the first partner and so much the senior of the second.
That's a good point.
It's a very interesting, I wonder what that did to her mind.
I don't know, but Michael Stern says that Clara was miserable whenever Brahms appeared to be falling in love with someone else. And Brahms even rebuked her in a letter saying, "In everything which concerns me, you have been and you will be as if I am yours entirely. But in everything which concerns you, I am not permitted to be anything to you." And they did have their disagreements because in the late 1870s, there was to be a concert to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Clara's debut in Leipzig. And she informed Brahms, quote, that unless he could combine the journey with some useful objective, he needn't come just on her account. But when he took her at her word and didn't appear, she was offended.
Oh, my goodness. Well, and that's the way it more or less went for the rest of their lives?
I think so. She was also upset with Brahms because he published got Schumann's Fourth Symphony published without her permission. And yet, despite the arguments, Brahms in the middle of one letter wrote, "You and your husband constitute the most beautiful experience of my life and represent all that is rich and noble in it." So I want to come to something else too, because one of the things that I found very demeaning was that sometimes critics, when they were analyzing Clara's work, would say that they were lightweight because they were written by a woman. And yet when I listen to them, there's nothing lightweight about them at all.
Absolutely not. No, that's just...
pure chauvinism.
Yeah. I was going to say rubbish. But
yeah,
same
well,
thing.
that too. But then there was this thing which I find fascinating, which is called the war, that been dubbed sort of the War of the Romantics.
Oh, I love this. This is great.
Yeah. And as I gather, it was kind of, well, if you're British, you would say a schism. If you were American, if you say something else. But anyway, it was a schism among musicians in the second half, I guess, of the 19th century. And really, it was Liszt and Wagner on one side, if I'm right, and Clara and Brahms on the other. Is that correct?
More or less, yeah. I mean, those are great epitomes of both sides of the situation.
So what was the difference? Like, what were they arguing about?
I think Wagner and Liszt were looking for something new. They were looking for something new and fantastic and probably related to social elements of the time. Whereas Clara and Johannes and Robert and several others, even Mendelson, even Chopin, if you want to include that, were looking at something more absolute, more divinely inspired, essentially something from the past that would be persevered. So the Wagnerians were looking for program music that told fantastic stories and fantastic imagery and great swaths of passion. And the purists, if you will, were looking for classical perfection.
So they were holding to the forms from the past.
Very much.
Would that be correct?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. But I think that the Wagner and Liszt were thinking, well, the forms just can't keep going. We need something more. We need something new. And it's fantastic because I think it created in Clara especially a very interesting dichotomy between those colleagues that she really loved and approved of, and those that she essentially hated, almost to the word. And that included Liszt and Wagner. And it's even though she forced herself to listen to the work of those composers, she just could not bear it to her own sensitivities. I think she understood it, but she couldn't bear it.
Did that happen later in her life? Because as I say, at one point, I know Liszt actually played her music
Oh,
in
absolutely.
a concert.
Oh, yes. No, there. And Liszt was a smashing guy.
Yeah.
Very,
he was
very friendly.
interesting.
Well, he was certainly a very, very interesting, but friendly and positive about everybody. You can just see him just loving everybody in the whole shebang. And he'd sit at the piano and he'd play scores of notes and improvise, and everything was great. And he'd be up all night partying, and then he'd get up and do a concert the next day of everybody's pieces, and he'd sort of half trash them and half play them brilliantly, more than anyone has ever heard. Let me read you something that really, from Clara's pen, that really, I think, encapsulates her angst over the Liszt situation.
Okay.
She says that she finds his music to be a chaos of the worst dissonance, with an endless murmuring in the deeper space and the highest treble at the same time, boring introductions, etc. I could almost hate him as a composer. As a performer, however, his concert on the 13th absolutely astounded me, especially in his Don Juan fantasy, which he played overpoweringly. His performance of the Champagne aria will remain unforgettable. The bravado, the pleasure with which it was played was unique. One saw Don Juan with the popping champagne corks in his wantonness, as only Mozart could have possibly imagined him. And after the concert, we all had supper together. Of Liszt, there was not much to be seen, since two women had attached themselves to him. I'm convinced that the reason Liszt displays such arrogance at times is really the fault of the women, because they pay court to him everywhere in a way that is intolerable to me, and that I also find highly improper. I venerate him too, but even veneration must have a limit. On the 16th, Liszt played for the last time and performed Beethoven's E-flat major concerto masterfully. But then he played Robert's Fantasy in dreadful taste, and after that, the Galop. He seemed tired, which is not surprising considering the way he lives. He had come early that day from Halle, where he had a wild night, and still had 3 rehearsals in the morning. Liszt came to the soiree at the Schumanns at our home, as always, late, and he seems to enjoy making people want for him, which is something I don't like. He strikes me as a spoiled child, good-natured, tyrannical, amiable, arrogant, noble, and generous, often hard on others, a strange mix of characters. Yet we have become very fond of him, and he has always treated us with the friendliest way. So it's just
wow.
There's
it's
jealousy
very
in
perceptive,
that.
actually.
There's jealousy in that. There's appreciation. There's rebuke. It's just an amazing thing. So it must have been for a person who was brought up to do the right thing by a father like that. It must have
and
been.
a husband. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I mean, you realize that both of these women, I mean, their works were hidden from public for at least 100 years before they were revived. And I just think that is one of the wonderful things of the 20th century, that their voices are being heard again. Because now you and I and Donna went and heard, was it a trio or a quartet?
A quartet,
trio.
Yeah.
The quartet.
You weren't listening either.
Well, I don't count fairly well.
Well, I'm not sure what story you're going to tell. That's why, because we've seen
but
both.
We went to Kerner Hall and heard Fannie's music. And I just think that it is so wonderful that now, after all these years, they're being given a place in the musical lexicon that they really deserve.
Yes, absolutely, and they certainly do. And let's not let's not forget the other influences they had hugely of Clara with her teaching, because she was a very renowned teacher for years and years, and actually taught people who went on to teach great pianists in England, and went on to teach people who taught at the Juilliard School of Music, and these are huge things. And then as an editor and all kinds of things. But as a composer, it really is as a creative artist. Both left us such a wonderful legacy that it's going to be really fun to explore.
Well, I have to say, Brian, thank you so much for doing this today, because I loved doing the research on these two women. I just found it was fascinating.
They're so inspirational, and one can only be inspired by these.
Absolutely. Well, Until next time.
Okay, until next time. And Barb, we're going to leave you with the last sounds that Clara Schumann herself heard. This is the Romance in F sharp major, Opus 28, number 2, composed by Robert Schumann and performed by Clara's son while she was on her deathbed.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. This is the 9th episode of this podcast that was started back in March of this year. So if you enjoyed this look at the life and music of Clara and Fannie, go back and have a listen to all of those previous episodes. If you're listening on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe to let us know you're here. If you have found us on iTunes, Spotify, or any other platform, please follow the podcast to be notified when future episodes are released. There are some fabulous digital concerts at the barn being recorded right now, and they will be released within the coming weeks. Brian has sat down with some of these artists to have conversations about their music making. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those inside looks. Thank you again to our sponsors, Finley and Associates, as well as Caravaggio Orthotic Clinic. We are so grateful for your support. With no ticket revenue being earned this year, Westben is relying on government funding, the support of our members, sponsors, and foundations. So now more than ever, we give our thanks. We look forward to being able to welcome everyone back to the barn at some point in the near future, but until then, stay connected with us on social media, on our website, and email us your thoughts to westben@westben.ca.